The market was busy as usual, filled with chatter, the smell of fresh bread and the sounds of merchants trying to sell their goods. People moved around, haggling, laughing, and exchanging stories. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its warm glow on everything below. Among the crowd there was one figure who stood out, not because of her clothes, but because of the way she carried herself. She was a woman, but not like the others. Her hair was dark and tangled, and her skin was the color of the earth after rain, soft yet weathered by time. Her clothes, a simple cloak of black and brown, blended with the shadows as if she didn't quite belong in the bright, busy market. She moved quietly through the crowd, her eyes sharp and watchful, scanning everyone and everything around her. She was used to being alone, and in a place like this, surrounded by strangers, it was safer to keep to herself. The villagers had always whispered about her, calling her the Crow Woman. Some said she had mysterious powers, others said she had a dark past she kept hidden. Whatever the truth was, nobody really knew. What they did know was that she wasn't someone they could approach easily. She never stayed in one place for too long. She didn't talk to people, didn't make friends. She simply existed on the outskirts of their world. Today she was walking through the market as usual, not buying anything, not stopping at any stalls, just moving with the flow of the crowd, her eyes focused on the horizon. She wasn't sure why she came to the market today. Maybe it was out of habit, maybe it was just for the chance to see other faces, but she didn't stay for long. The noise, the people, the confusion, it all felt too much at times. As she was about to leave the market, heading toward the dirt path that led out of the village, she felt a presence behind her. It wasn't the usual crowd or the busy chatter. This was different. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowing, and saw a man standing there. He wasn't tall, but there was something about him that made him stand out. His weathered clothes were simple but practical, and he had a face that was rough from working in the fields. His brown hair was messy, and his beard, though unkempt, seemed to fit him perfectly. He had the look of someone who spent more time with animals than with people. He didn't smile or say anything at first. He just watched her, his eyes studying her, trying to read her in the same way she always studied the world around her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the market continued behind them, but in that small space between them, everything was still. Then the man spoke, his voice rough but clear. "You're coming with me," he said simply. Lyra, the Crow Woman, stopped in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat and her eyes locked on his. She didn't know who this man was, but his words made something stir inside her. She had never been one to take orders, especially not from strangers. Her life had always been her own, her choices hers to make. But there was something in the way he said it, something serious, something urgent. It was almost as if he wasn't asking her to follow him, but rather telling her that it was her only option. For a moment she stood there, unsure of how to respond. She knew she could walk away, ignore him, and keep going on her own way. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her pause. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had asked herself that question many times in her life. Why had she chosen to live alone? Why had she stayed out of the way of everyone else? And now why was this man asking her to follow him? The man didn't answer right away. He seemed to think about it for a moment, then took a step closer. "I've been alone for too long," he said quietly, almost as if talking to himself. "I need someone. The silence is too much. It's not right." Lyra didn't say anything for a while. She studied him, trying to make sense of his words. She could tell he was lonely just by the way he carried himself. There was something empty in his eyes, something that spoke of years of solitude. She understood that. Loneliness was something she knew all too well. But that didn't mean she was ready to let someone into her life, into her world. She had learned long ago that people only brought pain, and she wasn't interested in finding more of it. "I don't need your company," Lyra said coldly, turning away. She didn't want to talk about loneliness, not with him, not with anyone. Her own past was too painful to share, and she wasn't about to let some stranger into her world. But the man didn't back off. He stayed where he was, standing tall and firm. "I don't need you to fix me," he said, his voice steady now. "I just need someone to be there." Lyra hesitated. She could feel his words sinking in, digging into her heart. She had been alone for so long, but the idea of being with someone else, even someone like him, was unsettling. She wasn't used to the idea of needing another person. She had always prided herself on her independence. But there was something different about him. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, But something told her that this encounter wasn't just an accident. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was something else. She didn't know. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke again. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice was still guarded, but there was a hint of curiosity now. The man's face softened, and for the first time since she had met him, a small smile appeared on his lips. "I live outside the village," he said. "I don't have much, but I have enough. Enough for two. I won't make you stay forever, but it's better than being alone." Lyra considered his words carefully. She had never been good at trusting people, but there was something about him that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. He wasn't asking for anything more than her company, and for now that was enough. Without saying another word, Lyra nodded. "I'll come with you," she said quietly. The decision wasn't made lightly, but it felt like the right one. For once, she wasn't running from something. She was running towards something she couldn't quite name. And so, with no more words spoken, the two of them left the market behind, walking toward a new beginning. It was the first step on a journey neither of them had expected, but both of them would need. The early morning light poured over the hills as Corin and Lyra made their way away from the village. The winding path was empty, save for the two of them, walking side by side in a quiet kind of solitude. Corin's heavy boots crunched over the dirt, his pace steady and strong. Lyra, on the other hand, walked with a cautious step, her eyes always searching the path ahead as though she were expecting something to happen. She didn't know what to expect, but something inside told her this journey would be different from any she had taken before. The silence between them was thick, neither of them feeling the need to fill it with words. Corin wasn't much of a talker, and Lyra wasn't one to speak unless she had something important to say. So they walked in their own quiet worlds, each one lost in thought, their footsteps matching in rhythm. Corin had tried to offer a few words on the journey out of the village, but Lyra had remained distant, not quite ready to let him into her world. He understood. He had never been good at forcing conversations. In fact, he didn't even know why he had spoken to her in the market. It was as if something had pulled him toward her, a feeling that he couldn't explain, a need to not be alone any longer. His life had been simple, but it had always been solitary. He had grown up in a small, quiet home on the outskirts of the village, raised by his grandmother after his parents had passed when he was young. She had taught him how to tend the sheep, how to live off the land, and how to survive in the harsh environment. But as the years passed, his grandmother had died too, leaving him to live alone. He had never felt completely alone until she was gone. At first, it had been bearable. He had his flock of sheep, his cabin, the land around him. But slowly, the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months. The quiet became unbearable. It was a silence that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. He didn't have anyone to share his meals with, no one to talk to when the night was long, and no one to laugh with when something funny happened. It was just him and the land, and the emptiness that seemed to stretch out endlessly. That was why, when he had seen Lyra in the market, he had felt the overwhelming need to ask her to come with him. It wasn't because he knew her or because he thought she would be the answer to all his loneliness. It was just that she looked like someone who understood what it meant to be alone. Lyra, however, was not so easily convinced. As the miles stretched on, she kept her distance from Corin, her mind running over all the reasons why she shouldn't trust him. She had learned long ago that people often took advantage of others' vulnerabilities. She couldn't afford to be weak, to let herself be vulnerable. She had to keep herself protected at all costs. But as the hours passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps it was the way Corin had spoken to her, or perhaps it was just the fact that she hadn't been alone for the first time in so long. Either way, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something to this strange journey they had begun together. They stopped for the night in a small clearing, the trees providing shelter from the evening chill. Corin gathered some dry wood and started a fire, while Lyra sat off to the side watching him. She wasn't used to depending on anyone. She had always relied on herself, and the idea of relying on someone else, especially a stranger, was unsettling. But there was something about Corin that made her feel that perhaps this wasn't as dangerous as she had first thought. The fire crackled and popped, sending small sparks into the darkening sky. Corin sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the flames. He didn't speak at first, knowing that Lyra wasn't one for small talk. Instead, he simply let the silence stretch on, hoping she might feel comfortable enough to speak when she was ready. Lyra stared at the fire, her thoughts drifting. She had always felt like an outsider, never truly belonging anywhere. The village had never felt like home, and the market was nothing more than a place where she could pass through unnoticed. She was used to being invisible, to slipping into the shadows and staying there. But with Corin, things were different. He wasn't trying to figure her out or push her into something she wasn't ready for. He was simply offering her something she had never had before: company. It wasn't the kind of company she had expected, but it was real. There was no pretense with Corin. He wasn't asking her to change to be someone she wasn't. He just wanted her there. After a while, Lyra spoke, her voice softer than usual. "Why did you ask me to come with you?" she asked, not looking at him but staring into the fire. Her words were direct, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath them. She wanted to understand him, wanted to know why he had chosen her of all people. Corin took a deep breath, his gaze still on the fire. "I've been alone too long," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to understand, but it's different when you don't have anyone to talk to, anyone to share the days with. The silence becomes too much and you start to forget what it's like to have someone beside you." Lyra didn't respond at first. She simply listened, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never thought of it that way. For her, being alone had always been a choice, a way to protect herself. But Corin's words made her realize that for some people, loneliness wasn't a choice. It was a weight that bore down on them every single day. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," Corin continued, his voice steady. I just wanted to ask if you could walk with me for a little while. If we could share this silence together." Lyra looked at him then, really looked at him. His eyes were open, honest, and there was no hiding the loneliness there. She had spent so much of her life hiding her own feelings, but there was something about him that made her feel like maybe it was okay not to hide for once. "I'll stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but only for a little while. I'm not promising anything more." Corin nodded, understanding. He didn't expect more than that. For now, the shared silence was enough. And so as the fire crackled and the stars began to appear in the sky above, the two of them sat together in quiet companionship. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt completely alone. The days passed slowly as Corin and Lyra continued their journey through the hills, heading deeper into the wild, untamed land. The sun rose each day, casting a warm glow over the landscape, and set in the evening, turning the sky into a canvas of reds and oranges. Each day felt like the same, yet different in its own way. There was something about the land that felt timeless, as though it had always been here, and would remain long after they were gone. They traveled on foot, their steps crunching through the dry earth, the only sound the whisper of the wind in the trees or the distant calls of birds. Corin led the way, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his life on the land. His steps were steady, sure, and Lyra followed behind, her pace slower, more cautious as she observed the world around her. Lyra had never been one for long journeys. She had always kept to herself, always moved from place to place, never staying long enough to let herself grow comfortable. The idea of staying in one place, building a life, had never appealed to her. Her past had taught her that people were unpredictable, and trust was a fragile thing. But with Corin, something was different. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was a quiet understanding between them. Neither of them spoke much, but in their silence they seemed to communicate in ways words never could. At first, Lyra had kept her distance, not allowing herself to get too close. She watched Corin carefully, always waiting for him to show some sign that he wasn't to be trusted. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized that he wasn't like the others. There was no agenda behind his kindness, no hidden motive. He wasn't trying to change her or force her into anything. He simply wanted someone to share the silence with, someone to walk beside him as he made his way through the world. And yet, despite this growing sense of comfort, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. She didn't know what it was, but there was a nagging sense of unease that followed her, like a shadow that refused to leave. As the days turned into weeks, they found themselves traveling deeper into the hills where the land became more rugged and wild. The trees thinned out and the air grew cooler, the scent of pine and earth filling their lungs. They camped under the stars each night, and Karan taught Lyra how to build a fire with only the smallest of sticks and a bit of kindling. It was simple, everyday knowledge for him, but for Lyra it was a reminder of how different her life had been. One evening, as the fire crackled between them, Lyra finally spoke. "How did you learn to live like this?" she asked, her voice low and thoughtful. "How did you become so at peace with the land?" Corin looked at her, his eyes flickering in the firelight. He had expected the question, though he hadn't known when it would come. It was the same question that people had asked him his whole life, and each time he found it harder to answer. "I grew up here," he said slowly. "I was raised by my grandmother. She taught me how to live off the land, how to survive in the wild. We didn't have much, but we had each other and we had the land. My parents died when I was young, and after they were gone, it was just her and me. She was tough but kind. She didn't waste words, but she taught me everything I needed to know." He paused for a moment, his gaze drifting to the flickering flames before him. "When she passed, it felt like a piece of me went with her. The land became all I had left. But it wasn't enough. I thought I could live here alone, but the quiet started to feel too heavy. That's when I saw you in the market." He turned his eyes to her, meeting her gaze. "I don't know why I asked you to come with me. Maybe I was hoping you'd understand." Lyra stayed silent for a moment, her mind running over his words. There was something raw in his voice, something that spoke of loss and longing. She had never known a life like his, but she could understand the feeling of loss. She had lost her family, lost her place in the world, and in many ways she had been searching for something ever since. But she had never thought that something might be another person. "I didn't grow up like you," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I never knew what it was like to have someone teach me how to live. My life has always been different. I've been alone for as long as I can remember." Corin looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said gently. "You don't have to carry all that weight by yourself. You don't have to hide from the world." Lyra shook her head, pulling her knees closer to her chest as she looked away. "It's not that simple. I've learned how to survive on my own. I don't know how to depend on anyone else." "You don't have to depend on me," Corin replied, his voice quiet but firm. "You just have to walk with me side by side. That's all." For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling between them, the wind rustling the trees in the distance. Lyra didn't know what to say. There was a part of her that wanted to believe him, to trust him, but that part was buried deep beneath layers of doubt and fear. She had never allowed herself to depend on anyone, and she wasn't sure she could start now. "I don't know if I can," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. Corin nodded slowly, as though he had expected this answer. "I understand," he said, "but I'm not asking you to change overnight. You don't have to trust me all at once, but if you can walk with me just for a little while, I promise it will be enough." Lyra didn't reply. Instead, she stared into the fire, the flames dancing before her eyes. The night was quiet around them, but inside her a storm of thoughts swirled, each one tugging her in a different direction. She had spent so many years running from people, from emotions, from anything that could make her vulnerable. But something in Corin's words made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was beginning to think that maybe she didn't have to face it alone. And that thought, small and uncertain as it was, felt like a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The days grew shorter as autumn slowly wrapped the land in its cool embrace. Corin and Lyra had been traveling together for nearly a month now, moving through hills and forests, across rivers, and beneath the wide sky. The journey was peaceful, but there were times when the silence between them felt thick, almost as if the air itself was holding something back. Lyra still kept her distance. She wasn't ready to open up, not yet, but Corin never pressed her. He had his own quiet strength, a kind of patience that Lyra found both comforting and unsettling. He was the kind of man who didn't rush things, who seemed content to let life unfold at its own pace. He didn't ask her questions about her past or demand that she tell him her story. Yet there was something in his quiet way that made her feel as though he understood more than he let on. The nights were the hardest for Lyra. As the sun dipped, below the horizon the world around them grew dark and cold. They would sit by the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, and sometimes Corin would speak, but it was always about the land or the weather or his past with his grandmother. He never talked about his own feelings. And Lyra? She kept her thoughts locked away, hidden behind a wall of silence. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Lyra found herself staring into the flames. She had always been drawn to fire, to the way it danced and crackled, alive with energy. It reminded her of the moments in her life when she had felt truly alive. Brief moments, but moments all the same. Corin had just finished telling her about his childhood, about how his grandmother had taught him to care for the sheep and how he had spent long hours alone with the animals, watching the land change with the seasons. His voice had a calmness to it, a kind of peace that Lyra envied. He seemed at ease with who he was, with the life he had led. But she, on the other hand, had never known such peace. Lyra shifted her gaze from the fire to Corin, watching him as he poked at the embers with a stick. He had been quiet for a while, now, and Lyra could tell there was something on his mind. Something he wasn't saying. For a long moment she debated whether or not to ask him. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. But something in her stirred, a need to understand, to know what made Corin tick, what made him so different from the men she had known before. Finally she spoke. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice low. "What's on your mind?" Corin looked up at her, his eyes flickering with surprise. He hadn't expected her to ask. He had gotten used to the silence between them, and even though he had hoped she might eventually speak, he hadn't pushed her. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. But now that she had asked, he felt the weight of her question. "I'm just thinking," he said slowly, his voice soft. "Thinking about how everything is changing, how the world is changing." He paused, his gaze turning inward as if searching for the right words. "I spent so many years living alone, never really thinking about anyone else. But now," he let out a breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Now I'm not so sure what I'm supposed to do. It's like I've forgotten what it's like to have someone to talk to share the days with." Lyra listened, her eyes fixed on him as he spoke. She could hear the sadness in his voice, the quiet ache that had been there all along. For the first time she saw the weight of his loneliness, how it had shaped him, how it had followed him even when he didn't want it to. "It's strange," he continued. "I always thought I could live without anyone else. But now that you're here, I'm starting to see that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I've been hiding from what I really need." Lyra's chest tightened at his words. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to hearing someone speak so openly about their feelings. She had spent years burying her own emotions deep inside, hiding them from the world. She didn't know how to share them, how to let someone in. But there was something in Corin's voice that made her want to try. For the first time in a long while, she wanted to be understood. "What do you need?" she asked softly, almost to herself. Corin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked into the fire, as if the flames held the answer. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I guess I need something I didn't even know I was missing. Maybe it's just someone to walk with me. Someone to share the quiet with. It doesn't have to be anything big, just someone who understands what it's like to be alone." Lyra felt her heart soften at his words. She had always thought of herself as strong, independent, someone who didn't need anyone else. But Corin's words made her realize that even the strongest people could feel lost sometimes, could feel like they didn't have a place in the world. For a long time, she didn't say anything. She simply sat there staring into the fire, feeling the weight of the silence settle around them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It was a quiet kind of understanding. A moment where words didn't need to be spoken for them to know what the other was feeling. As the night grew darker, Lyra felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to escape. She wasn't running from her past or from the person she had been. Instead, she was simply here, in this moment, with Corin. And for that moment it was enough. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to share the silence yet, but I think I could try." Corin turned to look at her, his face softening with a quiet smile. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said everything he needed to. In that moment, Lyra knew that she had made the right choice. Maybe they weren't going to solve all of each other's problems, but they didn't need to. All they needed was to share the journey together, one step at a time. The fire crackled between them, the flames casting long shadows across the ground, and for the first time since they had met, Lyra felt like she wasn't alone anymore. As the days passed, the land around Corin and Lyra began to change. The deep green forests of the hills gave way to wide stretches of open fields, where the tall grass swayed like waves in the wind. The weather had shifted too, growing colder as winter approached. But despite the change in the world around them, the silence between the two of them remained comfortable and easy. It was as though they had settled into a rhythm, each knowing the other's space, each knowing what was left unsaid. They had been walking together for over a month now, and although they hadn't exchanged many words, there was a sense of understanding between them. Lyra no longer felt the need to keep her distance from Corin. She had seen the kindness in him, the way he helped without expecting anything in return. He was not like the people she had known in the past, the ones who had let her down, the ones who had broken her trust. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. But even with that understanding, there were still parts of her that were hard to reach, parts of her heart that she wasn't ready to open. Her past was too painful, her scars too deep. She couldn't let them show. She couldn't let anyone see the hurt she had carried for so long. Corin, for his part, was patient. He never pushed her to speak about her past. He never asked her questions she wasn't ready to answer. He had his own struggles, his own history, but he never spoke of it unless she asked. The quiet between them was a kind of unspoken agreement, one that they both respected. He had always been a solitary man, used to the silence of the land, and in some ways, this new kind of silence, this shared quiet, was enough for him. But on one particularly cold evening, as they sat around the fire in a small valley, something shifted. The stars above were clearer than usual, and the night was still. Lyra had been staring into the fire for a long time, her thoughts lost in the flames when Corin spoke. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice soft but filled with a gentle curiosity. He had noticed her distance in the last few days. She had been more closed off, even more than usual. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like there was something she was holding back, something she wasn't ready to share. Lyra didn't immediately answer. She had learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and for a moment she simply sat there, listening to the wind whispering through the trees. Finally, she looked up at Corin, her eyes meeting his. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what you said a while ago, about not being alone." Corin nodded, his eyes gentle but attentive. He knew what she was talking about. It had been a long time since that conversation, but he remembered it well. He had told her then that she didn't have to be alone anymore, that he wasn't asking her to stay forever, just to walk with him for a while. It had been a simple offer, one born out of his own need for company, but something in his voice had made Lyra stop and listen. "I know I don't have to be alone," Lyra continued, her voice steady but quiet. "But sometimes I think it's easier to be alone than to trust someone. I've spent so many years running from people, running from my past. It's hard to let someone in even when they don't ask for anything in return." Corin sat quietly, letting her words sink in. He understood the fear she was speaking of, the hesitation. He had felt it himself many times before. There were parts of him he didn't want to share, parts he had buried deep within. But over time he had learned that carrying those parts alone was much heavier than sharing them, even if it meant risking vulnerability. "I know what you mean," Corin said after a long pause. "There are things in my past I haven't shared either, things I've kept hidden for a long time, but I've come to realize that it's not about sharing everything all at once. It's about taking small steps, trusting little by little." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. She had never been one to trust easily, and the idea of opening up even to someone as kind as Corin felt like a terrifying leap. She had always protected herself, built walls to keep the pain away, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her walls had been keeping more than just pain out. They had been keeping people out, too. "I don't know if I'm ready to take those steps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of what might happen if I do. What if I trust and then I lose everything again?" Corin looked at her with a calmness that seemed to reassure her, though she wasn't sure why. You don't have to lose everything, he said. You only have to decide what's worth holding on to. For a moment, Lyra didn't know what to say. She thought about his words, about the life she had lived and the choices she had made. She had lived in the shadows for so long, afraid to face the truth, afraid to trust anyone with her heart. But maybe, just maybe, Corin was right. Maybe it wasn't about making a grand decision or rushing into something she wasn't ready for. Maybe it was about taking small steps, just as he had said. Maybe I could try, she said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty but also a hint of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Corin smiled, a small but sincere smile. You don't have to try alone. Lyra nodded, her chest tightening as if something inside her was beginning to shift. She didn't know where this journey would take them, or what the future held, but for the first time she felt like maybe it wasn't as important to have all the answers. Maybe what mattered most was the decision to trust, even if it was just for a little while. As the fire crackled between them, Corin and Lyra sat in comfortable silence. The night stretched on, the stars above like distant beacons guiding them forward. They had no idea where the road would lead, but for the first time, neither of them felt completely alone.